Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Kevin and Maddie need to be added as panelists. We can't share our slideshow because they don't have the setup to do that because they are listed as attendees and not panelists.
So who, Kevin and who?
Maddie Capshaw.
People on the team.
Hey.
There we go. Hey guys. Is there someone in the room that needs to open the workshop for us to get started?
I can do that, AJ. So basically we'll introduce them. So this is our team from Verdity. Verdity is doing our comp plan for the city. One of the processes they do, they went through and looked at our land use and so forth, and that's kind of like what we came in. And they present this to our EDC board, and we thought it'd be good for city council to see. So that's why we brought it in. They have a lot of information that they've gathered and talked to us about where they want, how we should manage some of the stuff in our city, especially city streets, property, for example, maintain property taxes to those. So that's the purpose of this workshop. I know as they go along, it'll be fairly quickly, but they do have time for questions, so I think that's what they're looking for. Anything else you want to say, Jay?
I think that's good. We can go ahead and take it from here, Joe. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you.
Kevin, are you able to share your deck?
Yeah, hang on one sec.
If everybody here, you're okay there?
Yes. Me. This is being a little weird. I'm gonna go ahead and put this in presentation mode. There you go, AJ. Can you see that?
I can see the presenter view.
Yeah, well, that's not what we want.
We can see his presentation mode is up there for us.
I'm just gonna, if it's okay, AJ, let's, can you see it now? Let's
Yes.
just run it from this one, because for some reason, when I go to presenter mode, it's wanting to share the wrong screen.
Okay. So as Joe shared with you all, we are currently working through the comprehensive plan process, and we recently held a meeting with the advisory committee that you put together for the comprehensive plan, and we revealed the results of the land use fiscal analysis. And after that meeting, we had some great conversation, and city staff said, as Joe mentioned, that they really felt it would be helpful for the council to have this information. So I'm just going to run through a couple of items at the top of the presentation just to remind you of where we are in this project. And then I'll hand it off to Kevin Shepard, our CEO and founder, to go through the kind of foundational basis of the land use fiscal analysis and then talk specifically about Dalhart's results. So we have, as I mentioned, been doing a series of meetings with your advisory committee. We had a trip initially into Dalhart where we had 2.5 days of meeting with people in the community. Our last meeting with the advisory committee, we worked on a vision statement for the community. And as you look at the timeline here, we are nearing the end of the second phase. So we started this effort, as you may recall, back in July of last year. And so in the second phase, we've been working on visioning with the committee. We've also been working through getting some different community input by way of virtual tools, as well as some in-person opportunities during that first trip. And we'll be back again in June for a second trip and some more opportunities for in-person engagement with residents. We also have spent this phase working on your land use fiscal analysis. And as we move into March, taking us through the beginning of the summer, we will start in earnest on putting together the different components of the plan, which is a series of different maps that were scoped in the contract when you all asked us to come on and do this work. We will also be doing, to Joe's point, a future land use plan for the community and looking at some different mobility and growth um, opportunities and recommendations, and culminating this entire effort in November, December of this year, where we'll be bringing it to you all as a council to consider it for adoption. So that's a very brief review of the timeline and where we are. Since that first workshop, we did have that check-in with this group last in November on the 13th. We've also done a survey of local businesses to try to learn more about the culture of entrepreneurship there in Dalhart, what's missing, what's working well. We've worked on an internal outline of the plan document itself. And in the last few weeks, we've been working with your staff on mapping some specific things. We're focused on housing initially. We also are going to be looking at downtown and some infrastructure areas around the community. And then, of course, a lot of review and analysis of data that we've gotten directly from the community, from your staff, and that we've gathered on our own. Next slide, please.
There we go.
So this is the drafted vision statement that the advisory committee came up with. We also utilized this in a survey tool recently to get some public engagement surrounding the statement. The statement they came up with was that Dalhart is a diverse community that merges its rich agricultural heritage with urban progress, fostering a prosperous and close-knit community rooted in a culture of giving back. We are dedicated to upholding our rural identity, cultivating economic opportunity, and creating a memorable community where people choose to live, thrive, and prosper. That was a culmination of a lot of input we received from the staff, from some of your boards and commissions that we've done interviews with, from your advisory committee, and from the public as well. We will continue to show this and include this in our engagement moving forward. So for today, our focus is going to be largely on, as I said, laying kind of the foundational and educational basis for what a land use fiscal analysis is, and then delving deeper into what the numbers and Dalhart show us and some recommendations that are rooted in that fiscal analysis. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Shepard. He's going to take us through this presentation. Please make a note of any questions that come to mind as we go through the presentation, and we will set aside some time at the end to answer those questions. Also, if you have questions after today, because this is going to be a lot of information, you can also feel free to get those to Joe, who can share those with our team, and we can respond through email as well. So you'll have a couple of different ways that you can submit questions. So Kevin, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, AJ. Well, good morning. I think it's still morning for for a little bit longer. Good to be with you all. This is something that I get to do for most of our planning projects. This fiscal analysis concept is really the kind of the fundamental foundation of why I started Verdunity and the work that we do here. And just to kind of get us going, what this basically talks about is that there's a relationship with the way that your city builds and develops, where, when, and how you add development in your town or your city directly impacts the long-term fiscal health and affordability of your community. So in a state like Texas, a property tax state like we are, if you think about it, what we build on the ground should generate enough in tax base to pay for the infrastructure and the public services that are supporting that development. In reality, though, what we're seeing is in quite a few places, not just in Texas, but across the country, that's not the case. We build stuff on the front end. Developers will work with us. They'll put new neighborhoods, commercial development in. But when you look at the long-term costs that it takes to sustain those places, especially when it comes to street infrastructure, our cities don't have the money to continue to serve and maintain that over time. And so what this process is really about is showing you all how your development pattern there in Dalhart performs in terms of property tax generation, the cost to serve different properties in the city. And so you can use this information, and our team will use this information to inform your growth strategy going forward, so that you can, over time, you can address the infrastructure costs that you have, but you can also hopefully close that gap a little bit between what the city needs over time and what revenues you have to provide those services. So, is Dalhart fiscally sustainable? These are some of the questions that we always ask as a starting point. The first one at the top there is, does the city have enough money to pay for basic services and infrastructure, not just now, but in the future? Most of the time when I ask this question in presentations, whether it's just at a conference or if it's part of a project like this, the usual answer is no, we don't have enough. We could use more. In some cases, we could use a lot more. The second question is, when you look at your revenue sources, when you look at the money coming into the city's general fund, how much of that is dependent on more volatile sources like sales tax, new development revenue, that you don't have as much control over, versus property tax, which is a more stable and predictable revenue stream? Just talking about sales tax, that can go up and down based on all kinds of conditions. We saw just with COVID and how that impacted things, but you don't have a lot of control over the sales tax market necessarily. The second one, when you think about development fees, you'll go through kind of boom bust cycles as far as when you have development activity and the revenue that comes from that, building permits, impact fees, those kind of things. But development revenue is a one-time revenue source. You get it one time when that development comes in, and then that has to be replaced with property tax or sales tax or other revenue over time to sustain it. And then that's when we come back to property values and property taxes. They're, until something changes at the legislature, that's still the primary funding source for our local governments in Texas. When you do your annual budget, that's a little easier to predict year to year what kind of revenue you're going to have. And so we encourage cities to try to use property tax as your primary funding source to cover as much of your basic services as you can, so that it frees up sales tax to do more quality of life, economic development type investments. The third one that you see there is just asking the question of, can your current and future liabilities be addressed while also keeping housing and taxes affordable for your residents? So in some places we work, they may have the revenue that they need to take care of things, but it's because the average home value in that town is $500,000. So they have the revenue as a city, but it's not really affordable for most people in the town. And then the last question is, if you do have gaps here, whether it's on the city revenue resource side, or if it's the residents affordability side, what can we do? What can the city do to leverage development going forward to close those gaps intentionally over time? So I already kind of referenced this, but when we study the suburban development pattern, basically post World War II, where we shifted from a more compact development pattern that just like what you all have there in your core downtown, the way we built our cities before World War II was primarily around the pedestrian, the human, walking, and so you saw stuff more compact, more of a mix of uses together. But 1950, 1960, and there we saw a shift to more of the suburban autocentric pattern where things started to spread out more. We would build things bigger and faster. And when you dig in and really start to study a lot of those places, 30, 40 years after they went through their growth period, they're struggling to have the revenue to maintain everything that was put in by developers early on. And that was kind of my aha moment back at my previous job when I was working around the country and starting to just ask the question of why so many places were struggling to pay for basic services and infrastructure when we're supposedly a pretty prosperous country. So, and in Texas, we've really embraced the autocentric pattern, whether that's first and second and third ring suburban communities around one of our major metros, or even in a lot of our rural communities where we've started to spread out a little bit as well. So if you think about the resource gap that cities have, that we need more money to provide our public services and our infrastructure. What are our options to close the gap? There's really, you can kind of simplify this down to three. The first one is we can increase taxes or fees. Nobody likes that option. Very few can afford that option. The second option is reducing services. So this is basically what we do now with whether it's our annual city budget, if it's a capital improvement program, we always look at what revenue do we have, and then we'll set our budget to match that. And anything that we don't have money for, we defer to a future year. But when you do that over and over, year after year, you start to end up with parts of your city, neighborhoods that are neglected, and those that have the ability and the wealth to move will do that. And then you end up with this you start a cycle of decline where the neighborhoods really start to, the values flatten out, and then the folks move out, and then you start to see even faster deterioration of the neighborhoods, which nobody really wants that as well. And so the third option is, what can we do to develop more responsibly or in a more fiscally productive way, so that we can align what is being built in the city and what it costs to serve that development pattern with what the residents are able to afford now and in the future. So we like to say fiscal sustainability is a common language. When we talk about developing responsibly, that means different things to different places. But really what we're talking about is, how can we build a place that the city has the revenue it needs to provide those services over time, and also, again, do it in a way that's affordable for everybody living there. So let's dig into just the methodology here a little bit of what we do, how we do it, and then I'm going to talk about Dalhart's results for you guys. The main metric that we use is property tax revenue per acre. So we take the actual property tax that's paid by a property, we divide that by the size of the property's area, and you'll get a revenue per acre number. And so that revenue per acre gives us a way to compare how different properties do on more of an apples to apples basis, which I'll get into a little bit more here in a second. So a couple of concepts that are important to understand when we're talking about how do we maximize the property tax revenue that we generate from our development without having to change the tax rate. And so it has to do with the development pattern itself, the types of buildings, the way you orient them on lots, the size of the infrastructure. But on the lot building side, the first one I want to talk about is just lot coverage. So this shows the impact if you have a 2,000 square foot home or just a 2,000 square foot building on 3 different lot sizes. If you put it on the smaller lot there, you'll see that revenue per acre is almost 15,000, versus if you put it on a larger lot, you can see that revenue per acre is less than half. The takeaway here is the more building you put on a property, the higher revenue per acre you're going to get. So the flip side of this is things like parking, things like a larger yard, things like stormwater detention or stormwater management. Those are all things that take up land that don't necessarily create value or taxable value back to the city. You still need those things, but it's a little bit of a balance. If you go too far towards building, not having enough buildings on your land, then you're not going to have that same productivity or enough productivity to cover the infrastructure costs. The second thing to think about is going vertical. So, and this is a little easier usually for folks to understand, if you just think about a residential neighborhood, if everything's exactly the same, the streets and everything else, you have a 1-story house or a 2-story house, the 2-story house is going to be worth a little bit more than the 1-story. And so you get more value per acre out of that. The more vertical you go, if you go 3, 4, 5 stories, then you're going to see even more productivity out of it. But in a place like Dalhart, just the power of just building 2 stories can go a long way towards closing some of the gaps that you all have. So those are 2 concepts, and we'll come back to what those mean for your numbers in a second. But I also This is something that we've started to add to these in the last year or so to explain how this impacts the homeowner burden as well. Streets is probably the biggest unfunded cost in cities that we look at. The cost to maintain and ultimately rebuild streets is a really significant number that cities haven't been budgeting for. And so part of what we want to do to help residents understand this is show what it really costs to take care of their street. In this example, you've got 70-foot lots with a 31-foot wide street. This is a pretty typical residential setup in a lot of communities that we look at. And if you run the numbers on this, the cost to fix that street comes out to about $19,000 per lot. If we narrow that street just a little bit, if we reduce that street to 27 feet and we put 50-foot lots on that same block, it reduces that cost down to under 12,000 per lot. So just the width of the street and how many lots you put on a street can really impact how much each homeowner is responsible for when it comes to rebuilding that street. If we look at those examples here and say, well, what does the home value need to be to cover that cost? In this example, we're assuming, and this is just a generic example that we'll present everywhere, but in this one, we've got a 0.5 tax rate, and we assume that 10% of your property tax revenue is going to streets. I'll say right off the bat that that is not usually what we see. We usually see 1%, 2%, 3% maybe that goes to streets. But with those numbers, with that 0.5 tax rate, 10% going to streets, that first scenario I showed you with the 31-foot wide street and the 70-foot lots, the average home would need to be $760,000 to pay for that street. If you go down to the 27, the bottom row there, a 27-foot wide street with the 50-foot lots, it saves you a little bit, but your average home still needs to be almost $500,000 to pay for that street. Very few places have average home values in these numbers, and again, if they do, it's not affordable for many people. And so I'll come back, or I'll get into that a little bit more here in a bit of what that means for you all in Dalhart. When we look across all of the work that we've done, all the different cities that we've studied, these are some of the characteristics from the best performing development. I mentioned if you look at those characteristics on the left, the high ratio of building footprint to lot size, the more building you put on a property, the better it's going to do. If the more vertical, the more stories you have, the better it's going to do. Narrow lot frontage, the more lots you put on a street. There's a couple things there. The narrow lots and the smaller lots, those two together kind of work to build a more productive, fiscally productive neighborhood pattern. Narrower streets in a grid pattern is another one. Like we always see in the downtowns, we used to build the narrower streets in the grid, and then you start to see in newer parts of cities where it's more spread out with whether that's cul-de-sac style development or maybe more kind of rural estate, larger lot development. You guys have a little bit of everything there. But that traditional pattern of the grid pattern is more productive in terms of supporting a different mix of uses and different heights of buildings and less parking, things like that. On the right side, this just sums up the different types of land use or building typologies that we'll look at. The high density mixed use always has the highest value per acre. You get into single family, depending on small lot, large lot, is kind of in the middle. And then the big box commercial and the industrial is almost always the lowest in terms of property tax revenue per acre. But it's always important here to mention that those are also important to communities in terms of sales tax and job creation. So you want a mix of everything, just like a personal investment portfolio where you might invest in different things to spread your risk out. Same thing applies to the way a city develops, is you want to mix and match what you're building so that you've got some higher producing stuff, and then you've also maybe got some of the other uses in here that are important for commercial and employment opportunities. And then also residential, having that whole spectrum of what different folks want and can afford at different stages of life. So very, 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 very simply, if you want to increase property tax revenue, if you want to improve service efficiency of police and fire, trash collection, if you want to reduce your infrastructure costs over time, the two biggest things that you can do, or that any city can do, is build in a more compact pattern, put people and places and things closer together, and narrow the width of your streets and go back to that grid pattern. Those are very simple things to say. They're very hard things to accomplish in today's environment sometimes. But showing this math and talking through these concepts is part of how we help cities think about how they might accomplish those two things. So the first part of this land use fiscal analysis that we do is looking at your population and your budget. So how has Dalhart been growing? Where have you been putting the people? And then, what's your budget look like? So population, you guys have had a pretty slow growth over the last several decades. But when we compare this to your service area, I don't think I have, we don't have the slide in here that shows your city limit area and how it's changed over time. But what this slide is showing is really over the last couple decades, between 2000 and 2023, your service area or your city limits has grown by 28%, but the population there has only grown by 16%. The reason this is important is if you think about your city and the way that you're growing, the more outward you go, the more area you expand, you're adding police, you're adding additional area that police and fire have to serve, trash collection, you're adding additional streets and infrastructure, pump stations, lift stations, all of the, could be more community parks. There's all kinds of things that come with growing outward. And all of that has a cost to it. But when your population density doesn't keep up, in this case, your population hasn't grown at the same rate, you're adding more cost to the city, but you're reducing the number of people that are able to, or the population per acre, I guess, that's able to pay for it. So the cost per household or the cost per person is going to go up. And I'll show you what that specifically looks like here for you all in a second. In terms of your development pattern, we look at a couple things. We look at, how much of your property is developed? And in this language, it means, does it have a building on it or not? You can see here that this is one of the big takeaways for you all. Only 58% of the property in your city limits has been developed. That's all on the map there on the right. All the green properties have a building on it. All of the gray properties are undeveloped land. This is land that's in the city limits that the city is obligated to serve. But because it doesn't have a building on it, it's not generating very much tax base back to the city. And so those residents and businesses that are in the green properties that are built out are having to carry some of that cost for those undeveloped properties. And we also we don't have a slide in here, but we also looked at whether the property is served or unserved. So does it have infrastructure service to it? Specifically street, water, and sewer, with the thought that if the property has city infrastructure, then it should be carrying its share of that cost. If a property is undeveloped, kind of out on the edge maybe, and doesn't have city infrastructure to it, then there's really no reason for it to carry some of that infrastructure cost because it's not getting any of the benefit of having that infrastructure to it. When we look at the budget, this was a little interesting here too. Your property tax makes up 30% of your general fund revenue. Sales tax makes up 28%. So you have close to a 50-50 split between those two, which is good. The bad part is that together those make up less than 60% of your general fund. So a lot of your revenue comes from fees, fines, charges, franchise fees, transfers. Those are things that aren't a really resilient, sustainable revenue stream for you. And so you're always going to have those, but those should be a smaller percentage. You want to try to strengthen it where you can get more of your revenue from property tax and sales tax. And so as we got to this point in the analysis, we were already starting to ask the question, well, how can a place like Dalhart start to generate and bump those revenues, knowing that you don't have full control of the market or how fast things are going to develop there, but just putting it on your radar that you should have a goal that over time you want to increase that proportion of your general fund from property tax and sales tax. If you can get that up to 80% of your general fund, that would be a really good place to be. If you can keep that 50-50 split between property tax and sales tax, or even get to where your property tax is up to 50% of your general fund, that's a really really good goal, and would put you in a really financially strong place if you can get there. On the expense side of your budget, 28% of your budget goes to public safety. We see a lot of cities that number is all the way up to 50% of a general fund goes to public safety. And as a city grows, as you grow both in area but also in population, you can expect to see that public safety percentage go up. The really encouraging thing here, though, was that 15% of your expenditures is going towards streets. I mentioned that target earlier in that example of 10% of the budget going towards streets. In a lot of places, we see 1, 2, 3% of their general fund being dedicated to streets. You all have a pretty high percentage here going to it. The downside here is it's only $1.2 million a year, which is not going to be enough. If we look at how your general fund expenses compare over the last few years, if we put this in terms of per person or per household, you had a little bit of a bump in fiscal year 2021 because of some of the pandemic revenue. But what I'd point you to is up in this top right table. If you look at those bottom 3 rows, your general fund per capita it's starting to trend back up. You're at 973 per person for for fiscal year 23. Your general fund per household is a little under 2,700. Your general fund per acre is a little under 2,700, but from 22 to 23, they're trending upwards a little bit. And the takeaway that I want you to have here is that bottom bullet is when you build in a more spread out way. When I was talking about that slide earlier about how your population hasn't grown at the same rate as your area, when you grow in a more spread out way, you're going to see that general fund per capita and per household going up, because you've got more things to do and fewer people or households to pay for it. When you build in a more compact manner, you're going to see your revenue per acre, your general fund per acre is going to go up, but the cost per household and per capita is going to go down because you have more people and dwelling units to pay for those services. So every city is a little different on when you hit that threshold of when you're going to start to see the revenues the revenue productivity from your pattern going up and the cost going down. But those are metrics that I'd encourage you to. They're really easy to calculate every year with budgeting, and it's something just to keep an eye on and know which direction you're trending. Okay, so street costs. This is the big number that is a key part of this that we want everybody to understand. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the cities that we've studied, and I was studying prior to starting Verdunity, they went through rapid growth in 50s, 60s, 70s. And now all of those neighborhoods that were built by developers are having to be, that infrastructure is having to be maintained by the city, and they haven't saved up and don't have the money to pay for it. So one of the things that we do is just say, what if you had to replace all of the streets in your city right now today? What would that cost? And your number, and we tend to, these are a little bit lower than I think what they really turn out to be. But your number just to replace all of the streets in Dalhart right now is a little over $136 million. If you average that out over a 25-year life cycle for a street, that comes out to a little over 5 million a year. So if you really wanted to have your streets in good condition and take care of them over time, you'd need to be saving or spending roughly 5 million a year every year for the next 25 years and onwards. So you're spending a little over $1 million a year from your street fund. So you've got a deficit there of about a little over about 4.2 million per year. One of the things that you can do, one of the recommendations that always comes out of this is definitely start by doing whatever you can with Public Works to get a proactive and aggressive inspection and preventative maintenance program in place. So do what you can to extend the life of your existing streets as far out as you can. And then anything new that you're building, make sure that you're inspecting those and building those new streets, or developers are building those new streets to a really high quality. Because if you build them with modern standards, modern materials, and they're well inspected, they're going to last a lot longer than what some of our older streets that were built before our standards and materials technology improved. So do everything that you can to extend the life of your existing streets. I think that last one is interesting, a little bit unique to you all. You've got some dirt roads, you've got some brick streets. I think, when you're evaluating whether or not you want to upgrade dirt or gravel or caliche roads to asphalt or to brick, you really need to think about the long-term costs of doing that. And I just say that from, I won't name names, but there's a couple cities up to the north that have actually, they built out streets with concrete and asphalt. They weren't able to maintain everything. And now they're at a place where they're actually letting some of those go back to gravel because they didn't have the revenue that they needed to maintain them. So I just like to encourage here, the engineer in me likes to just say, make sure you're thinking, when you're building something new or thinking about upgrading a street, think about the long-term cost of doing that. So where would Dalhart need to get if you were going to have enough property tax revenue to cover these costs? These are rough numbers intended just to kind of give you some targets to look at. And we look at these in our planning process as well. On the left with your current budget, you've got a general fund per acre at a little over 2,300. Your property tax revenue per acre is about 715. And the average assessed value per acre across the whole city with your current tax rate is 173,000. So that varies all over. That doesn't necessarily take into account the size of different properties. That's just the total assessed value in the city divided by the total acreage of the city. If you were to say, okay, we want to increase our general fund and our property tax enough to cover all of those unfunded streets that I just talked about, you would need to get your general fund all the way up to 8,000 per acre. Your property tax revenue per acre would need to get up to 2,500. And then your average assessed value per acre across the whole city would need to get to close to 600,000. Those are really high numbers. I don't know that it even makes sense to even talk about the one on the right, which is if you continue to grow outward and add to your service area, you've got a lot to make up, and then you're going to be taking on even more. So it's really important for you all to think about how can you add population, how can you add taxable value to your community without adding any more infrastructure at all, or really, really limiting what additional infrastructure you build. Looking at your maps for a second. So this is the assessed value. So this doesn't take into account the property size yet. All this shows is the darker green properties are the highest value properties in the city. The light blue are the lowest value. And so you can see, a couple places in here are they're on the tax rolls at over 1.25 million. But it's only, you've got just looking at this, it's roughly, that's 1% of your parcels, that's 16% of your acreage is in some of those really high assessed valued properties. If we go to the assessed value per acre, so if I take the value of the property, I divide it by the size of the property, this is what it looks like. The same scale, the darker green are the highest ones, the light blue are the lowest. But you see a little bit different picture here of if in this one you just look at the overall number, the overall value of that property. But in the second one, you put it in terms of the per acre value. I'll just point to that very big property down in the bottom middle of the map. It's dark green. It's assessed at a lot of value on the tax rolls, but when you divide it by the large acreage, it goes down in your lowest category. When we I've got a couple more. So if we want to come back in Q&A and kind of look at some of these, zooming in a little bit more, we can do that. We've got some slides in here that zoom into these different parts of the town, but I'll just focus on this part of the city. This is your core traditional part, the central part of Dalhart. You can see that traditional street grid in there, and you can see a lot of the dark green properties that are popping out. In there. This is full service, full infrastructure. Most of this is also developed. When you shift and go back to the previous slide and you look up to the northern part of the city, a lot of that is undeveloped land, and there's some reasons for that we're aware of. Some of that has to do with infrastructure and service capacity. If you go to the southern part of the city, you can see a few areas that have developed and have some value to them. You can also see some undeveloped land. And then we didn't do it because you can see it on these other slides, but the industrial park out there, or the business park out there to the left, that was one of the very first areas that Joe had mentioned to AJ and I when we were starting this, of what we were asked, what should we do with that area? And going into that, I already kind of had the thought of, I would maybe slow play that a little bit. After doing this analysis, it just reinforced for us that needs to be a lower priority, because you have other parts of the city that have infrastructure, or that it would be a little cheaper, more cost effective to get infrastructure to get value out of, versus punching infrastructure all the way out to there to serve the kind of development that you may want. Now, I don't know what all the input has been to date on that, as far as what the community wants, or in terms of businesses or employment. There might be reasons to kind of revisit that later on, but building out that business park is going to come at a significant cost on the infrastructure side of things. If we and just also too, if we sometimes with larger projects where we have a little more budget to work with, we'll go beyond the assessed value per acre, and we'll actually dig down into the property value per acre, the cost per acre, and some net per acre mapping. We didn't have the time or the budget to do that for you all. But just know from this one that the assessed value per acre, your property tax value per acre, is going to follow this same trend. So if you see the properties here that are higher on the assessed value per acre, if you were to do the tax revenue per acre one, they'd follow a similar trend there. So the last part that we like to do is just give you some examples of some places there in town and just show you the real numbers. This shows 213 Denrock, the little whimsy. This is something that over and over and over, when we do these small kind of commercial spaces in the core downtown, I'm guessing this is probably a 25-foot wide lot by 100-foot deep, maybe 75-foot deep. But so this is really small acreage, 0.16 acreage. It's got, and then if you look at that assessed value per acre, it's over 3.7. It's almost $3.8 million per acre for that little business there. If we go to one of your higher performing residential ones, still it's a pretty small lot there. The acreage is 0.27. The value per acre is $867,000. And in this case, this one has 100% lot coverage. So the whole lot is covered with a building. That's why it does so well. In this case, most of the lot is covered with the building. You still have a little bit of a yard there. I'm not sure. I can't tell from this if this is a duplex. It kind of looks like it might be. Just looking at the double garage and the patios in the back. If we look at one of your just commercial properties, this is one of your highest value per acre. Commercial ones, 0.4 acres. You can see the value per acre there. This has a huge parking lot in front of it. We did not, I just want to point out here, like in a lot of places that we do this, we have much more development to study and look at. And so the places like this one that have larger parking lots on them won't do as well when they're compared to more of the properties like this that are more compact and have less parking or have shared parking in the street. So that's just something to think about. Again, if you want to try to get more tax productivity out of your land, looking at some of these, you've got spaces like this that I doubt that whole parking lot is ever full. And so, what are things that could be done there to maybe put a second building on it, or, I don't, every site is a little bit different with what you could do, but the fact that this is one of your highest producing properties, but still has a lot of parking on it, means you don't have a lot of the really, really ideal, more compact, high producing properties in Dalhart. If we zoom out a bit more and we look at one block of your downtown mixed use, just a really modest 1-2-story block of what I think everybody would say this is the core part of Dalhart that gives you the small town feel that everybody loves. It's a little over an acre. It's got the assessed value per acre of almost $1 million. If you compare that to a similar size tract of land on the right, it's a little over an acre also. We picked on the Taco Bell here. We've picked on Whataburger, Dairy Queen, Starbucks, Chick-fil-A. We've done a lot of different ones, but the trend is similar, where you can see the value per acre for this one is a little bit less than the mixed use. And again, that a lot of that has to do with the massive amount of parking and drive-through, that's taking up that land. It is important here, again, just to reiterate, it's not neither one of these is necessarily bad for your community. Everybody wants to have some of the drive-through restaurants, but you want to have a mix. If you build too much of the stuff on the right, you're going to spread the city out too far and get upside down fiscally. And the one on the left, if you really wanted to maximize the fiscal productivity of your land in terms of tax base, property tax, or sales tax, small town feel, walkability, the need for less infrastructure. These are kind of the two extremes for you to think about. If we zoom out a little bit more, we look at a little bit bigger area of the downtown, compare that to a big box. Same thing, the traditional grid has a higher tax revenue per acre than the big box. The big box does, like I was saying earlier, brings jobs, brings sales tax. But the thing to think about too with commercial development is not just the revenue that it's generating, but what can go in these buildings when the current tenant goes out. So say one of those businesses in your downtown goes out of business for whatever reason, it's pretty easy for a different business to go in there without a lot of changes from the city or incentives or anything like that. Versus the big box, if the big box leaves town, there's a lot, your options to either fill that space or to repurpose that space are much more limited. And so that's another part of what we do at Verdunity is we actually do some site development work in some older communities that have abandoned big boxes or strip centers. And we're actually trying to go in and repurpose those and turn those into more of like a neighborhood mixed use center, commercial center, that has more buildings and has a little bit more walkability to it. So again, it's every community needs the big boxes, but just beware of having too many of them. This just shows it again. This kind of shows the big box on the left. It's got a commercial or the strip center in the middle, and then the downtown mixed use. So we see this over and over and over in every community. And it really just comes down to how you use that land. The reason the one on the right is so productive is because there's shared parking in the street. It's a very efficient use of that land and that infrastructure. The other two have a lot of that land going to parking that most of the time is probably not full. So those are things to think about when you get into your design regulations and what you require in terms of parking or open space or anything like that with your developers. On the residential side, same kind of comparison. We've got a rural neighborhood on the left. We've got more of a traditional kind of grid block neighborhood there in the middle, and then a newer suburban neighborhood on the right. Your suburban neighborhood is by far the highest value per acre. I would argue that's because the values in that neighborhood are also a lot higher. What I point out here, though, is from other places that we've looked at, that traditional neighborhood, if you have, if most of it is developed, and if most of those homes are in decent shape, newer type homes, that traditional neighborhood will usually outperform any of the suburban style neighborhoods, just again because it's more compact. What you're not seeing on this slide, and what we didn't do with you all because we haven't factored in the cost side of the equation, but I can tell you when we've done this for other places, when we have done that, the traditional neighborhood again usually does the best in terms of holding its value even when you assign street and service costs to it. The suburban neighborhood, those usually a lot of those will go negative because of the wider streets and the cul-de-sacs and some of the larger lots. And then the rural neighborhoods are really all over the place depending on what the value of the homes or the estates are, and then the kind of infrastructure. Is it very minimal infrastructure, a narrow gravel road or asphalt road with bar ditches, or is it a place where they've built out all of the infrastructure with wider, asphalt or concrete streets and underground storm sewer and underground sewer, but the values aren't high enough to pay for it. So that just know there's a connection with the lot sizes, the values of the homes, the configuration of the infrastructure, how wide the streets are. Is it a grid configuration, or is it more of the loops and lollipop kind of cul-de-sac suburban style? Those are all going to impact the overall productivity of the development. We did dig into this, and I won't go too far into these slides, but in the full slide deck, you can explore these a little bit more. But we show just examples of some of these different types of patterns looking at the assessed value. That this has a residential block. It shows some of the different. You can see some of the different lot sizes there. There's a couple of bigger ones, a couple of smaller ones. But there are, as I looked at kind of your downtown and those neighborhoods around it, there are opportunities with vacant lots or really large lots that you could have some infill development that could help you out. But this one, so in this case, it's, the average lot size was 0.2 of an acre. The average assessed value per acre was a little over 450,000. This neighborhood, average lot size is a little bit bigger, 1/4 acre. You can see that assessed value per acre is a lot higher. And then the rural one, we break that one down as well. So you can just kind of see the different configurations of the lots, the lot size and the value. And so just to wrap us up, and then we'll get into questions. And like AJ said, I totally understand this is a lot of information. This is the first time people have seen, in a lot of cases, have seen anything like this. And so, definitely take time to digest this. But these last couple slides are just the high level takeaways that our team had that we wanted to make sure that we conveyed to you all, and that I know AJ and Maddie, as the rest of the planning process goes forward, some of these concepts are going to come back in terms of looking at where you add growth and what kind of development in residential do you build and where. We're going to connect it back to how can we strengthen the fiscal health of Dalhart with more with more property tax productivity, and then how can we limit those infrastructure costs? This is just a summary of what I said earlier. The big takeaways from all of our work. Every city shows the same patterns here of almost everywhere that we've looked at has a gap with what they're ultimately going to need to maintain streets, water, sewer, with the revenue that they have. Almost everywhere in this country has some kind of a gap that they're looking at. If they don't, it's because they're not a very affordable or inclusive type of place, and some cities are okay with that, and some aren't. But most places across the country have a resource gap. When you think about growth, the second bullet here, when you think about growth and development, not all growth and development is good for a city. If it's going to add liabilities, if it's going to create more costs on the back end than what it's bringing to you in terms of revenue, it may not be the right thing to do. So sometimes saying no to development is an okay answer. If we switch a little bit and think about, okay, what is the right kind of development? What are the things that we want that will help us close this gap, that will generate more revenue, that won't add a lot of additional service costs or infrastructure? That traditional grid, the downtown and the neighborhoods around it, those almost always outperform suburban or rural type development around the edge, especially when you look at the net per acre when you load in the cost side of the equation. And I've already hit twice on what makes up the highest producing parcels, that building footprint, the multi-stories, the smaller lots. Specific to your numbers, to Dalhart's analysis, a couple of the big takeaways that jumped out to our team. Only 31% of your revenue is coming from property tax, and revenue from your new development is pretty minimal. So that puts a lot of pressure on your sales tax and all of those other funding sources, the franchise fees, the service fees, the fines, the forfeitures, all those different things. There's a lot of pressure on those sources to basically fund, the annual budget of your city. And so trying to figure out how to generate more property tax without having to change the tax rate. So look at your development pattern. That's definitely something that you want to try to look at. That street funding gap is also big. So anything that you can do to prioritize funding to take care of your streets, maintain, fix it first. So maintain what you already have before you're building more. And then we talked about those general fund per acre targets. This is really, I guess I would explain this one of, you have a pretty large city limit service area for your population size, and a lot of that land is undeveloped. So you have a high cost obligation for the rest of the folks that are in the city. So anything you can do to, I don't know that you can go to the extreme of de-annexing or shrinking the size of the city, although that is something that some cities that have been on the really kind of extreme end of this challenge have done that. They've actually reduced the size of their city to kind of match better with what they could continue to provide services to. I don't think y'all are at a place where you need to do that, but anything that you can do to look at prioritizing development of vacant land that's in the city that has full infrastructure service to it, that's where you want to start. You're not, with the market out there, it's pretty unlikely that you're going to see really robust, aggressive growth in your sales tax and development fee revenues. So you have to be thinking about how over the next decade or two, you can start to get this development pattern in alignment with what your residents are able to pay. In some places, it might be a transparent conversation about, we might need to raise the tax rate, or we might need to add a street fee or other kind of fees that will help kind of get some of that revenue to get caught up. A lot of cities that I've talked with, sometimes the initial response to that is you're hesitant to go to your residents and say, we need more money. But the other side of that is if residents know kind of what the situation is, the base assumption of a resident is that, yes, I pay property tax, and so my city has all the money that they need to pay for everything, but especially my streets and sidewalk and basic infrastructure. But when we've had that conversation with folks and can explain that that may not be the case long term, and that the city does need a little more revenue to kind of maintain those services, you'd be surprised. I think a lot of folks will lean into that conversation and say maybe we are able to pay a little bit more as long as we know what it goes towards. So don't be afraid necessarily to have those conversations. But kind of pairing it up with that is, don't just go out to residents and say we need to raise the tax rate or we need street fees, and then continue to approve or encourage development that's maybe not as productive as it needs to be, meaning that it's adding more liabilities to the equation. So thinking, what can you do with incentives with developers to try to guide development into your downtown, into those vacant lots? If you have really large lots, can you put, a second building on it, even something as small as like an accessory dwelling unit, on a large lot, putting a small unit there that can be an affordable unit for, maybe it's for mother-in-law, father-in-law, or or maybe it's a unit that you rent out to a young professional or somebody that can't afford their own home yet. Just little things like that can go a long way towards closing the gap, and doing it kind of working inside out, working your core downtown first, and then work out from there. That'll go a long way towards closing your gap as well. That's really what the first bullet here is just focus on infill as much as you can. The second bullet gets into, after this comprehensive plan, if you come up with a land use map and a growth strategy of where and where you want to focus the growth and what you want it to look like, then you have to look at your development standards and your zoning, your infrastructure design, and say, do our standards allow this kind of development to happen? In some cities, their zoning doesn't even allow small lots to happen. It just has a minimum lot size and says you have to build 7,000 or 10,000 square foot lots. And it doesn't even allow some of the smaller stuff to happen. So you want to do some kind of a diagnostic or an assessment of your codes and say, do our codes align with this new vision development plan and priority of fiscal sustainability? And if they don't, what are some things that you can do quickly? And then what are more a bigger lift, sometimes to redo or rewrite some of your codes. And then the last thing is just, anything. You guys don't have a lot of resources at your disposal. So where you invest city resources, whether that's economic development money, incentives, capital improvement projects, coordinating those together to try to guide the development into the places that you want, can really help. So a lot of the infill kind of development that I've talked about, it's not your bigger developers that are going to do that. It's going to be local folks that maybe you already have a few people that are already building small buildings. But part of the discussion that usually comes out of our comprehensive planning process is looking for more people. It could be local carpenters, it could be electricians. There's a lot of different folks that kind of get into it, but looking at people who have the interest to become a small developer and want to try to get together to start to build some of these, smaller houses or smaller commercial buildings on these infill properties. And then whatever help the city can do, can help them with, whether it's helping to finance the upfront loan to get that done. There's a lot of different strategies and things that you can explore there that I'm sure AJ and Maddie will get into kind of later in this process. But I think that's, and then the last one, there's just, if you do have new development, try to do everything you can to prioritize development into existing areas that already have infrastructure and service. But if you are going to look at greenfield development, new development out in an undeveloped part of the town, make sure that you're really understanding those long-term costs of what's coming with it, because that's going to make some of those street gaps even bigger, and you want to make sure that you have a plan to either with that specific development or other development that you're going to help kind of get back on the path to close the gap over time. So I believe, yeah, I think that's it. So I know AJ, we have a couple of we have this last slide for just updates on the process, but I'm just gonna I think I can.
Yeah, actually, it looks like the slide should have been taken out. So our apologies on that because these dates are already behind us. But we will, as I mentioned, have some things coming up. As we look ahead, we have another visit in the summer to Dalhart. And between now and then, we are going to continue working on mapping a lot of the different pieces of data that we've been able to collect, starting to drill down a little bit further to provide recommendations on things like housing and infrastructure, talking about downtown revitalization a little bit more. So we are well on our way moving in that direction. So let's take the last few minutes we have and open that up. If anyone has any questions, we would be more than happy to address those with you now. Okay.
Was there anything in here that was just I mean, was it surprising to see? Is there is there or did you feel like you were pretty on top of this stuff and no surprises?
No, I guess seeing where the EDC has been developing, which has been out by the airport and more to that highway side, y'all are suggesting that's not the way we need to be developing. It needs to be more within the infrastructure around downtown and that area rather than out, is what I got out of your presentation.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I think there's certain kind of businesses that they're going to need more land. It's not something that's going to fit, and work in the core part of the city. And if those are some of the uses that you might think about. If the market is really telling you that there's a demand for that, and there's a real interest in some of that type of development, then yeah, it's and I would say I'd go even farther. If it's like industrial type stuff that really needs bigger lots than something that you might get across along one of your highway corridors or something. You can look at that. I just think I know when we were early on starting to look at that, there's a lot of infrastructure that would be required to get out there to serve that. And so to us, there's definitely an opportunity. You can still get commercial. You can still get a lot of job creation, but do it in more of a way that fits with more of the small town feel and does that kind of expands the environment in your main street, or maybe even starts to provide a little bit of like neighborhood commercial inside some of the other neighborhoods. And by that just means maybe it's it's one corner or one intersection that's got like a coffee shop and a store or something on it. But you've got land and room to funnel most different types of businesses into without having to add a bunch more infrastructure. The only exception would be, to me, is if you have some significant demand on the industrial side that would need those larger lots. But I'd just be really careful about the additional infrastructure investment it would take for the city to make that happen.
Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts?
That was easy.
Okay, well, again, if you think of anything between now and later, please share those with Joe and we'll be happy to respond to those. We really appreciate your time and attention today and look forward to continuing to work with you through the project and end up getting this plan adopted so you can kind of start forward in a direction that takes all of the things that you've already been doing that are good work and really directs them in a cohesive way. So we're excited to be part of that. So thank you for your time and we look forward to interacting with you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Did y'all have any other questions just while we're here or anything?
I guess for you, Joe, what did you think of that? I mean, just them telling you.
For a while, so we really haven't, we kind of where we're pushing the market, we haven't marketed it a lot.
Right.
Because it is the cost of that infrastructure. What lots we've sold have been right on the road, so we're not having to add roads. If you notice, we did add one, but it was an entry just to get in, but, we only paved, 100 and something feet. Just